Good evening, America. Tonight, we dive into the latest polling data as we approach the historic 2025 presidential election. It's a race that's captured the attention of millions, with former President Donald Trump facing off against incumbent Vice President Kamala Harris. We're here to break down the numbers, explore trends, and analyze what's happening on the ground as we track who's leading in the polls. Now, this election is shaping up to be one of the most contentious and closely watched in recent history. With Donald Trump vying for a return to the White House, and Kamala Harris, the first woman and woman of color to serve as vice president, now seeking to solidify her place in the Oval Office, the race is drawing intense scrutiny. The big question tonight: who's leading the polls as of November 2025? According to the latest national polling data, Donald Trump is currently holding a narrow lead in the polls, but it's far from a commanding advantage. Let's take a closer look at the numbers. A recent poll by Polling Agency shows Trump at 47% of likely voters, while Kamala Harris is trailing closely with 44%. This puts Trump ahead by just 3 percentage points. But, as we know, polling numbers can change rapidly, especially with early voting underway and key battleground states still too close to call. To begin, let's take a look at the national polling averages. As of now, polling data shows a tight race. According to the latest aggregate from Real Clear Politics and 538, Donald Trump has a narrow lead over Kamala Harris, somewhere around 47% to 44%, respectively. This is consistent with trends we've been seeing for much of 2025. But, as we all know, national polling doesn't always tell the full story. This is especially true in a country as large and diverse as the US, where regional dynamics, voter turnout, and a host of other factors can have a huge impact. So, while Trump may be ahead by a few percentage points on the national level, what's happening in the battleground states is what really matters. Let's talk about those crucial swing states: Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Georgia. These are the states that will ultimately decide this election. Right now, polling data from these battlegrounds shows that Trump has a slight edge in Florida, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, while Harris is holding on to a narrow lead in Arizona and Wisconsin. In Florida, the state that has been a thorn in the side of Democrats for years, Trump leads by 3 to 5 percentage points, which is consistent with his 2020 performance. His message on immigration, crime, and taxes resonates well with voters in rural areas and the Latino community, especially Cuban and Venezuelan Americans in Miami, but Kamala Harris isn't out of the game. In Pennsylvania, Trump is ahead by just 2 percentage points, but keep in mind that the state has shifted significantly over the past few years. Now, let's talk about enthusiasm. It's one thing to look at polls, but what really matters is who shows up to vote. We're seeing high enthusiasm on both sides, but for different reasons. Trump's base is fired up. His rallies are huge, and his messaging on restoring America's strength and making the country great again is resonating with a lot of voters. Many are driven by a desire for a return to the pre-Biden economy, promises of lower taxes, and tough stances on crime and immigration. There's a certain nostalgia in his rhetoric that appeals to working-class voters in both urban and rural areas. On the other hand, Harris's supporters are driven by issues like social justice, healthcare reform, and climate change. Her messaging has been focused on unity and healing, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and addressing systemic inequalities. She's seeing strong turnout among younger voters and communities of color, groups that have been crucial to Democrats' success in past elections. In fact, early voting numbers in key states like Georgia and Arizona are showing an uptick in early ballots cast by African American and Latino voters, which could bode well for Harris. However, these groups need to stay engaged throughout the entire election cycle to ensure her success. So, where does all of this leave us? While Donald Trump holds a slight edge in most national and state polls, the race is far from over. Polls are often wrong, and anything can happen in the final weeks leading up to the election. Polling models are based on likely voter projections, and this year, there's a lot of uncertainty around turnout. If young voters and minority groups show up in big numbers, Harris could see a late surge. If Trump's base turns out in force, we could see a repeat of 2020. with a close race coming down to a handful of swing states. But one thing is certain, no one can afford to take this election for granted. Both candidates have strengths, but also significant challenges. Trump is more popular with working-class whites and older voters, but his divisive style and rhetoric could alienate moderates and suburban women. Harris has made gains with young voters and communities of color, but her broader appeal to moderates and independents remains in question. As we look ahead, this is shaping up to be one of the most competitive elections in recent memory. The question is, who will win the hearts and minds of American voters in these final weeks? The answer, of course, will depend on how each candidate continues to campaign, how the issues evolve, and how each side manages its messaging as we approach Election Day. That's all for today's episode of Election 2025. Thanks for tuning in. We'll continue to monitor the polls and the political landscape as we get closer to November. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast and stay up to date with the latest news, analysis, and insights. I'm host's name. And I'll be back next time to break down more of the election action. Until then, take care, stay informed, and remember, your vote counts.